Welcome back to MG Marine Tech. As you guys can see right here in the background, I have the Kraken finally installed here on the One. That is exactly what we're going to be going over today. Installation of the Kraken and some of the things you guys want to keep in mind as you are doing your installation. Overall, this is a pretty straightforward process, especially if you're just replacing a trolling motor. On my boat, I had a Tarova on here and the bolt pattern did line up, but there was one thing that prevented me from using that bolt pattern. I'm going to cover all that here in the video to come. Like I said, pretty straightforward process, but there are a few main things you guys want to keep in mind as you are doing your install. So let's dive right in. So I wanted to show you guys that the Tarova and the Kraken bolt holes were exactly the same. So I have a couple of bolt holes in here now. They're going straight through the existing mounting locations for the Tarova. So it could be as simple as unbolting your Tarova and bolting on your Kraken. Now there are a few things that you need to keep in mind, and that has to do with the difference right here. The Tarova had a little bit longer of a mount here. It's about a 1/2 inch difference right here. That is a big thing to watch out for. If you take your Kraken, mount it in the same exact location, you could have an interference issue here with your bow. This line right here needs to be clear of the bow. And I'll show you, I have the Kraken up here, kind of mocked up in the old Tarova location. There might be a little bit of an interference issue here, but I may have to move this. I'm going to flip this motor up and see if there is any interference issues. Bad news on my install, it is not allowing the locking tangs to engage fully. So this trolling motor is definitely going to require new mounting hole locations. What's happening is that this on the back side here is just hitting the edge of the boat right in here. So it is not allowing the locking tangs to fully engage. Another major consideration that you want to keep in mind when placing your trolling motor, the location on the bow. When this motor is deployed, you want to keep the shaft of the trolling motor, the shaft will be straight up and down here obviously, you want to keep that shaft as close to the center line of the boat as possible. That is going to give you the best performance. Too far off to one side or the other, it's going to kind of pull weird and you're not going to achieve the maximum performance out of the trolling motor. So keep that trolling motor as close to the center line as possible, and the angle at which you choose to place your trolling motor. You can see when I shift this, it's going to stick the head of the trolling motor out past the gunnel of the boat. Obviously, if you have the shorter shaft trolling motors, this issue isn't going to be as big of a deal, and it's going to be a bigger deal with longer shaft trolling motors. All things to keep into consideration when picking the location of your trolling motor. I have my new bolt hole locations figured out. The way that I did this, you can use the included template to do that because it has the bolt pattern on here. That leaves a little bit to be desired because you can't really see the orientation or the angle of the trolling motor when it is stored and also deployed, how everything's going to kind of lay out. So here is what I did. I put the trolling motor up here, and then with no bolts in it, I very carefully deployed it because it kind of gets a little tippy. I deployed it all the way. I made sure I had my proper clearance here, and then without moving it, I laid it back down and made sure I had the clearance off to the side of the boat, because the longer shaft wants to hang off the side of the boat ever so slightly, and I got my angle to maximize my clearance all the way around. Once I got it where I liked it, I stood it up very carefully not to move it again, took a Sharpie, and then very simply just marked my new bolt hole locations on my carpet, and obviously not going to be seen once the motor is down here, and we're going to be drilling right through that hole anyways. I was able to get 3 out of the 4 locations with the trolling motor on here. Then I can take my template, simply line those up, and then mark my 4th hole. So that is how I did it. I think it's going to turn out really well. So I've got all 4 of my bolt hole locations marked out. Now I'm going to drill some new holes and we'll get this bad boy up here and bolted down. Something else you guys want to keep in mind, especially if you are installing a trolling motor on an older boat, this piece of material up here is often wood on a lot of boats, and they take a lot of abuse. This is a big, heavy object, especially when it's in the water. There's a lot of torque on this piece of material here. And over time, these small washers and whatnot can sink into the wood on these, or if this wood is damaged or rotten or soft, definitely consider replacing this piece of wood because it takes so much abuse. Other things you can do is put a backer piece of wood on there to mount these trolling motors, or pieces of aluminum to sandwich the wood on there. That will stiffen these things up a lot, especially if you don't want to tackle replacing this piece of wood, and that will buy you guys some time. Is it the right way to do it? Maybe not, but it will definitely help you guys out. It will stiffen this up and give you a nice solid mounting surface. When it comes time to actually bolt your trolling motor down to the deck using the included hardware, mounting location or the bolt hole is down here in between the trolling motor and the little edge right here. And this can be extremely frustrating to get down in there, especially if you're doing this by yourself. If you have somebody else, you could potentially deploy the motor and gain access to that hole much easier. And being that this is stainless hardware, it's non-magnetic. So do yourself a favor, just get your screwdriver, a piece of tape, and tape the bolt to it. This will allow you to install the first bolt very, very easily. Once you get that first bolt installed, deploy the motor. Make sure you keep in mind your latch on the front of your boat so you don't hit your trolling motor head on there. Once it is deployed, you can easily gain access to the other bolt holes in here much easier. We have her bolted down. She is exactly where we want her to be. Everything checks out, no clearance issues. The head stores perfectly fine. Now it is time to move on to some of the final install tasks, installing the prop, installing the transducer cable, and then last but not least, we are going to be covering wiring. But first, let's get the prop on, transducer cable hooked up, and then we'll jump into wiring. For installing the prop, this is a pretty straightforward, simple task. The most important part, I would say, besides the prop, is this little dowel pin right here. It's very easy to lose. Something you guys are going to want to do when you're installing this is make sure that the hole that this dowel pin fits in is not going straight up and down. Make it horizontal. That way you can put this in, it's going to stay in location, and you can make it much easier to line it up. Try to center it in the shaft once you have it installed there, and then you can install your prop. Now the prop has a flat keyway in it as well. That's what lines up with that little dowel pin, and that is what keeps your prop from just spinning on the shaft. So if you lose that little dowel pin keyway, this propeller is not going to spin very well at all. So do your best to line that up, slide it on there, and lined up there will be about a 1/16 to not even an 1/8 inch gap between the propeller and the body. Now it comes to the anode, and the anode has a little machined recess in it. That machined recess goes out towards you. The flat side of the anode goes towards the trolling motor. You put that on there, then the flat washer, then the lock washer, and then the nut. The important thing here, this isn't in Garmin's instructions at all. It's just something I like to do, especially when you're dealing with a stainless steel shaft and then a stainless steel nut, to put a little bit of grease and or better yet anti-seize on there, just to prevent this from seizing up in the future, galling up, because if that locks on there, it is going to be a major task to get it off, and you're most likely going to ruin this motor or the shaft of the motor itself. So I'm going to put just tad bit of grease on there just to prevent it from seizing up in the future. And then I am going to put the nut on the shaft and hand snug it down for right now. And there we go. And then it is a 9/16 nut, and the torque spec is 6 foot-pounds. Right there, that's 6 foot-pounds. Don't believe me, come check it out. There we go. Lock washer should do its job to keep that thing from falling off, and the prop is installed very simple. Again, 6 foot-pounds with that, hand tight, is going to be good. You don't have to reef that thing down there. To hook up the GT56 that is on the bottom of the Kraken trolling motor, this is where you are going to plug in the included extension cable. I am just going to simply screw this in here and then route it to my 106 Ultra I have here on my stowaway mount. I filmed a segment for this video that went pretty in-depth on how to wire the Kraken up. Once I got it into editing, I realized just how boring it was and that really it is an extremely straightforward process. If you guys tell me differently, and if you guys want an in-depth video on how to wire one of these things up, I can do that. But for this video, it's gonna kind of be a brief overview, and more importantly, tell you guys some of the products or some of the components that you're going to need for this. When it comes to components, there are several components, and you wanna choose the right ones, both so your system works at its peak performance and also so your boat is safe. The main components that we're gonna be talking about are the circuit breaker, the wiring size, and a plug if you choose to use a plug. When it comes to a circuit breaker, this is the fuse, if you will, for the system, and it protects both the trolling motor and also the wiring in the boat. If something were to happen, something gets hot, whatnot, it's gonna prevent components from melting and possibly catching on fire, etc. So you definitely need a circuit breaker. Now, the circuit breaker should be close to the battery. So it's gonna go from the positive side of the battery straight to the circuit breaker, out of the circuit breaker to the positive side of the trolling motor. That brings us to the wire that you need to use. Now, Garmin recommends nothing less than 6-gauge wire. My boat was pre-wired with 8-gauge wire, not going to meet the specifications that Garmin requires. So I had to make a new harness out of 6-gauge wire. If your batteries are way far away from your trolling motor, you may have to step it up to 4 and or 2-gauge wire. Now, Garmin has a chart for that. I can probably throw it up here for you guys as well. It has a distance from the trolling motor to the battery and what gauge wire you need to use. And the next part, especially if you guys choose to use a quick release plate on your trolling motor or on your install, you're going to need a way to disconnect the power side from the boat so that you can obviously remove the trolling motor from the boat. I opted to use the Garmin plug. Now, this isn't made by Garmin, but it's sold by Garmin. It is a very well-built plug. Now, the only reason I chose to do that is because I had a hole here from my factory wiring harness for the trolling motor, so I opted to replace it with I'm just gonna call it the Garmin one, even though it's not sold by them. Side note on this, and it's no fault of the plug itself, it's more of a Garmin issue. The way they wire these up with 2 reds and 2 blacks in the power harness, it is a pain in the butt to work with. Getting it into this plug, or I would think any plug, is kind of going to be a chore. It is possible, obviously. I got it done. It just took a little bit extra time and patience to deal with. And if you guys want to hardwire your trolling motor into your battery cables going back to your battery, you obviously can do that as well. That is another option. There you go, guys. If you guys want to know more about the wiring process for this, let me know in the comments, and I can definitely do a in-depth wiring only video for trolling motors, but it is extremely straightforward. The Kraken is installed here on the Lund. It is finally done, ready to hit the open water. This has been part 2 of the Kraken series. Part 3, we're gonna be installing a live scope LVS34 transducer into the Garmin. This is a pretty cool feature that Garmin came up with. Haven't seen anything else like it on the market for a live scope transducer mount. Pretty excited to film that and show you guys that. If you guys haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. At 15,000 subscribers, we are going to be giving away a live scope plus LVS34 system to one of you lucky viewers. So definitely stay tuned for details on how to enter to do that once we get a little bit closer to that 15,000 mark. But as always, guys, stay tuned for more tips and tricks on MG Marine Tech.